Welcome, and come join me on this critical look through of the Xbox 360, game by game. We're in shooter season of the release list with our second title, Quake 4. If Call of Duty is a combination of the PC and the console shooter, an amalgamation of two styles into something distinct, then Quake 4 is just a PC shooter that happens to be released onto a console. Now, before we get into gathering some context for Quake 4, I need to broach a subject that I will go into more depth with later: frame rate. This game runs like trash on the 360, so the footage in the background is going to represent this. It's what I've captured, but I'm still going to use it throughout. Basically, the game is bad, and not my capture setup. I do want to get into this more, but I feel like it's important to apologise for what I end up producing, so that you have some initial context before we get into the greater context. Speaking of, come join me in Context Corner. The fire is warm, the drink's cool, and I have some added context to talk to you about as we watch some video of Quake 4. There's a quote from John Romero on Quake 4 that goes something like this: "Quake 4 is where the brand went off the rails. Doom and Quake were mashed up together." Looking at Quake 4, you can't tell whether you're in a Doom game or a Quake game. We'll get back into this, but I think it gets at some of what is going on with this game. See, this is a first for the series, not being developed directly by id Software and instead being taken over by Ravensoft using id's engine, and some support work also. There are actually some interesting connections between Ravensoft and id, with John Romero collaborating with them on a few games in the 90s, including cult classics like Heretic and Hexen. So they have some experience making this type of experience. But by this stage, the Quake franchise is having a little bit of an identity crisis, especially in the context of what shooters were doing in a grander scale. You see, we're coming into a period where the definition of an id-style shooter was coming into question. Now jokingly labelled the boomer shooter, this is a period that we have already talked about in the COD video. The 60 miles per hour speed, huge weapon arsenal and interesting setting of this era were on the way out, making way for games that harken back to real world setting, using limitations derived from this to affect the weapons and also how the whole game just plays in general. The style and substance that originally created the genre of the first person shooter is now on trial. Developers trying to figure out how to update these games to bring them into the modern and wider audiences, not all just on the PC. The history of Quake as a series is vital to understanding these games. As a follow-up to Doom, it helped popularise looking up in games, also due to a troubled development that basically forces id to fracture into several different studios. It's well known for having many disparate thematical elements clashing together into one game. From Lovecraft to sci-fi, the first Quake is odd, but in a lovable sort of way. But the pressures of bringing these together, basically separate games, under crunched conditions for several months, meant the staff had had enough. And Quake 2 they also brought more of the same with updated graphics, lighting and level/mission design. id Tech was well known to bring the id and the tech, with massive improvements to how the games looked and functioned, especially in 3D first person space. That seems to be a massive part of the draw with these games, looking and playing with the cutting edge. This includes early multiplayer, of which only became more and more popular as the people gained access to it. The third game in the series, Quake 3 Arena, would be multiplayer only and is widely respected to this day, being highly important to the development of professional gaming, one of the early esports. The last thing I want to mention that does not quite fit into the rest of today's narrative, but I think it's an interesting tidbit, is speedrunning. Doom, but especially Quake, will always have a corner carved out to the interest of speedrunning, with speed demo archives logging many early runs of the game. The website, even with a niche spreading much wider today, has a category for the specific game of Quake, and it was its main feature for many years. Quake may no longer define speedrunning, and speedrunning probably would have taken off without it. It certainly held the torch for speedrunning for a long time, being one of its central pillars. As we discussed in the intro, Romero thinks Quake 4 is where the series lost some element of its design ethos, collapsing into Doom a little too much for its own good. Well, I'm here to say he's wrong. With the experience of time, we are now in a position to label Quake 4's setting as rad. Now, I don't necessarily have the context to let you know exactly how it fits into the id-verse, but this also doesn't matter, as Quake's 4 setting is, well, rad. Your enemy throughout the game is the Strog, a group of beings with a silly name, brutish behaviour and a penchant for knitting things together. Specifically their various mechanical creations along with whatever flesh they have lying around, and they're all out of flesh. So, engaging into a long war with humans for their fleshy deposits, we find a setting and a group of people with incredibly strong aesthetic sense, not far off a line from whatever is in the Adeptus Mechanicus version of Vogue. The biomechanical style pervades in a perverse way in everything they do, bits of bodies they had lying around used to create structures of their buildings, heads and torsos used for what I assume is computers. There are even some larger, grotesque things that exist deeper down in the Strogoverse that are a little upsetting, if not great design. So how are we situated in this world? Well, after crash landing on the planet, we were in the position of trying to reunite with our squad, constantly under the barrage of attack from the Strog. Often they choose to burst through walls at the most tense moments. After being on the planet for a while, regrouping with as many people as possible, Command starts to draw up plans that smell of a last stand and suicide missions. Not sure if this is what they had going on from the start. They surely had an idea of what they were going to be doing, right? We are going after anything that aids Strog control, as they are all sort of linked in this AI-style neural network. Losing this will mean that they will lose control of their individual soldiers. The process of actually doing this will be a very old school Doom clone, or, as the genre name has now been called, a first-person shooter, specifically a PC shooter, starting off with fairly quick movement, a range of guns expanding outwards, and having to pick up ammo and health in the environment. I talked how in COD we have now got the regenerative health, but also that I don't mind the more archaic health pickup system, and this game shows why. There are these moments where you're getting by on next to no health, and not only do you get the relief of finding a health kit, you also get this big flare signal from the developers. Not sure if there's going to be a big battle coming up? Well, this shit huge pile of health and ammo outside the door is setting off some of my well-developed gamer senses. Now, as ridiculous as this seems, there is still a joy for me in topping up every single last bit of ammo for the vast array of my weaponry, topping up my shields and topping up my health also. And what an array of weaponry there is in this game. Again, this is where a comparison to COD is interesting. That game let you have only a pathetic 2 weapons with you at all times, often forcing you to pick and change as situations called for it. Fine. But what if, hypothetically, I could be carrying, I don't know, 10 guns at once? There is fun in both of these styles of game development. The 2 weapons means taking a tactical choice depending on the situation, thinking about what ammo may be around, or sacrificing a sniper rifle as it just doesn't make sense in these bunkers. But what if you don't have to think? When you can just switch between all of these weapons, there is a feeling of being liberated. Now, the liberation does come at a cost on the controller. Gaming technology had not yet invented the weapon wheel, we just didn't have the understanding to put in such systems in those days. So you have to use either the D-pad system, which has all of the guns off in 4 directions, it taking multiple presses and memorization to accurately switch between firearms in the heat of battle. Making it worse, there is this short delay where the game is making a decision if the player intended to make a weapon change or not. So in the heat of battle, you have to wait a few seconds for your chosen gun to actually be taken out of its holster. You can also use the other system, the shoulder buttons, which just scrolls through the long list of weapons that you have in front of you. Clunky, yes, but I found it a lot quicker and easier to use than the other option. And the guns. What guns we have. It will always remain a part of the joy with id Tech shooters, the vast arrangement of guns that all do wildly different things, each useful in its own specific way. You see, combat and enemy development in this game are done in an interesting clip. By introducing an enemy, letting you fight it, learn it, we then scale up the difficulty by adding some of the old enemies back in, creating these variable configurations that all have an answer hidden in your arsenal. So these ghostly, haunting spectral ladies did not like the nail gun in my experience. But she could be paired with these dudes with shields, meaning that I want to change over to the dark matter gun. No, I'm not going to learn any of the names of the enemies in this game. These constant iterations of these little pieces, chunks of mechanics that you could also just call enemies, means that the game consistently remains fresh throughout. But from the nail gun to the assault rifle, shotgun to lightning gun, there is always an answer to whatever formation of Gribblies are attacking you. The game also has a hand at making all of the weapons good throughout, except maybe the pistol. I was still using the bog standard assault rifle towards the end of the game, still pumping that shotgun to splatter the fleshy mechanical beasts in front of me. There's a joy in experimentation, as well as internalization, knowing what weapon to use and when, and then just acting on it. It's so rare to have such a selection available these days, and this sort of design, combined with enemy variety, really allows an expansive approach that can make the game feel dynamic with limited pieces in play. Quake 4 feels fast from the off, especially on the back of playing COD 2, but in a scene replicating Wolfenstein 2, the modern one, we get a new body. After getting captured by the Strog, we get a montage of our own body being disassembled and then rebuilt, fresh with new flesh and upgrades from your enemy. Luckily, one of these is a switch at the back of your brain to make you fully Strog, which they haven't actually flicked yet, and your soldiers just happen to come in and rescue you, leaving you with your mind intact and your body more so. just not in its original form. This is where the speed of being mechanically and physically altered yourself comes in. It's a super cool part of the story. The game speeds up. Something to do with your new body, maybe robotic legs, you can now sprint around even faster, hold more health and armour, a perfect weapon accidentally created by your enemy to be turned around on them. But, taken in context of being such a high-paced game, along with the previously mentioned frame rate issues, we have a situation not dissimilar to playing on the N64. Ocarina of Time still holds up for me, but boy does it run at 20 FPS. There is something in being raised on such a machine means that I have a stomach to hold against the jarring and repeated drops in frame rate. I'll just mention that I was raised on games with poor frame rates, but Ocarina of Time rarely has moments of intensity. It's mostly glacial and slow, meandering and thoughtful, especially in comparison to what Quake 4 is. But the heritage of this game has the expectations of you running around at 60 miles an hour and gunning as well at the same time, and this game is just not able to keep up with it, to the point where it's impossible not to do a section on it, especially when we're talking about the 360 version. That being said, other people are just more sensitive to this stuff than I am, and legitimately too. I don't think you're wrong in saying that. You're not wrong to see this game as a trash fire. I just am, somehow, able to work with this trash fire. If I'm being generous, I think there is something in the fact that the frame rate slows and then raises. It doesn't just drop all at once or suddenly cut out. It sort of became a bit predictable and workable for me. But I think I'm the odd one out when I'm saying all of this. This all becomes especially applicable when we consider the type of game we're talking about. I think to the joy of playing Doom 2016 with its silky smooth frame rate allowing for deeper enjoyment, this fluid, speedy and dynamic combat that comes from a lineage of games that includes Quake 4 and goes back even further. And with this further context, the way that these games are meant to feel, especially when we're trying to bring this type of game to a place that was considered almost impossible, or at least improbable at the time, creates something that is just a bad sales pitch as to why these games should exist on a console. Along with the fact that weapon switching is just not quite worked out yet, it means that this particular game, with the way that we're having to play it, is a very, very hard recommendation, unless you just go and get it on Steam. Enough with the talking about the technical, I would say hiccups, but it's more like implosions. This game is still doing things that are notable. The background setting of the entire game does that thing of leaving you with questions. The combination of technology and brutality of the Strogg, clearly shown to be advanced of your own army, but deeply disturbing and corrupt also. I rarely see the best equipped army being the most brutal army in media. We have like these dichotomies set up in our head, like these understandings of how these different tropes work. Typically you think of the orcs in Warhammer, not a thought in their mushroom heads, charging in with barely held together weaponry. Or something like the Krogans in Mass Effect, hulking beasts with no joy for science. When we are painting in these really broad terms, strength and technology are often seen as polar opposites, so it's nice to have something that fights against that a little bit. This is combined with an aesthetic style which is not completely unique. Look at Geiger or Adeptus Mechanicus in Warhammer, but it has some unique points that carry a lot of visual storytelling. The huge heart beating at the centre of the Strogg base raises more questions than it has answers. And it's also these little details that are dotted around consistently throughout. The computers made of bodies, the med stations made out of hearts. You build an idea that these people see that these things should be combined, taking whatever they can and building it into the unholy. And then we are planted at the centre of this, a human that is taken and broken down into component parts, built back up again with whatever was lying around. The cutscenes where you are with your fellow soldiers after this stage in the story, you're standing a whole head above them. As you walk around the spaceship, you're being faced with disgust. It leaves you to be singled out, different. Even though this person that inhibits is still the same, the consciousness is still the same. This is not to say that the game is a big analysis of these sorts of themes, but it cannot help being but at least interested in these elements when it's building its setting. It's one that draws you in with curious disgust. It all ends up being so evocative without having to tell you too much. Something that existed in older games more so, I feel, where the capacity to tell a fully rendered story was less, where the limitations force you to use whatever you could to build up something that was different from the next shooter, scraping by with any bits of visual flair, bits of voice line or setting. Now Quake 4 is actually in the position to make something wholesale. It is on the technology, well maybe not the Xbox but at least the PC, to build so much more. But instead it chooses to echo a style of game that was born out of the series, the older Quakes. This game is fascinated with the intersection of the old and new, one being elevated further for being released on a new console. I talked a lot in the context of Quake section about how universal this series has been and how important it's been to many aspects of modern gaming. It brought to the forefront and was involved in the nascent beginning of both online competitive professional play, as well as speedrunning. It's hard not to hold such a central and pivotal part of games to high expectations. It then becomes difficult to watch Quake 4 just not meet these expectations. When taken as a game in hindsight, there's a lot of good in Quake 4. When taken with this in mind, you cannot help see a game that just does not live up to this. When a series becomes a monument of media, you want further iterations to keep this going. But I do love how unapologetic it is. A PC shooter on a console in this era is very little done to change the game, and it manages to retain much of the underlying design stylings of its heritage. It all comes at a time where things were changing in games so much that it really has the foot in the old. One that does not read too well at the time, especially being mired with the physical limitations. But I cannot help but like this game. It probably is the worst of the series for many, an example of not keeping up with the times. The alternative though? A Quake 4 made in the style of an era? Well, that would just probably be less interesting. If anything, this is probably the death knell of this style of game, especially on consoles, until somewhere around 2016, and boy am I glad did it get revisited there. But taken into the context with our next game, Perfect Dark, we have something that through ignoring the status quo and by doing its own thing is just far more fun to play. When considering it against COD 2, we can see its aging form, but there it is, still a core of a gem. As alluded to in the last paragraph, join me next time for Perfect Dark Zero. If you enjoyed the video, drop a subscription. We're going to continue going through every single game on the Xbox 360 in PAL release order. I say, I still have a couple of these in the bank, so we should be on weekly releases for at least a bit, but you know, life gets in the way of things. Like the video if you've enjoyed it. My name has been Billy. Peace.